having grown up in the Israeli left with the assumption that what stands between us and peace is the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza.
When you were in the Knesset, you were on the left?
Absolutely. I was a member of the Labor Party, even though I was already in the midst of the process, because the transformation really began when Ehud Barak, an Israeli prime minister of the Labor Party, of the left, was elected on a platform of making peace based on a two-state solution, establishing a Palestinian state, offered it only to have Arafat walk away, Clinton chasing him, he walks away. And walking away doesn't matter so much as that he followed it up with murderous butchery. And even more important, that there were no dissenting Palestinian voices who said, go back to the negotiating table. This is a great proposal. And I lived through that, and I lived through the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. I lived through another major round of negotiations with Ehud Olmert, an Israeli prime minister, with another Palestinian leader, Abu Mazen, to realize that, again, the pattern continues. Again and again and again, when given the opportunity to have a state of their own, no settlements, no occupation, capital in East Jerusalem, holy sites, they walk away, they follow it up with violence, and there's no debate and no dissenting voices. So I begin to ask a simple question. What do the Palestinians want? Because it's clearly not all of those things. And I find that, to their credit, they've always said. Yeah. They've always said what they wanted. We just didn't listen, or when we listened, it sounded so preposterous that we assumed it's bluster.
A tactic.
Yeah, it's a negotiating position. But they said, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. In case you wonder, free of what? In Arabic, they say, from water to water, Palestine will be Arab. And I agree with you. I think the great failure on the Israeli side is that on this issue, the Palestinians don't lie. They lie on everything else, from genocide to famine to open-air prison. When one lie is revealed, they replace it with another. But on this issue, that their entire ideology and identity and worldview is tied up with the negation of a Jewish state in any part, they don't lie about that.
And this goes back 100 years before the Nakba, before...
Absolutely. I always bring a quote when I give my full talk on this issue. It's a quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. If you know anything about Bevin, a friend to the Jewish people, he was not. And he goes to the British Parliament in February of 1947 to explain why Britain failed to fulfill the terms of the trust, the mandate that it received unanimously from the League of Nations to help the Jews achieve sovereignty. It did not fail the Arabs. It created Iraq and Jordan, and with the French, Syria and Lebanon. But the Jews don't have a state, even though they were supposed to have one after the Ottoman Empire was kind of sliced up. So he explains the failure. He says His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Now, this is February 47. The reason I love this quote is that in February 47, you have no settlements, no occupation, no blockade of Gaza, no Bibi, there was such a time, and most important, no displacement. You often hear the story that the conflict is because Israel, Zionism, displaced local Arabs. Mm-hmm. In February of 1947, no one has been displaced. Everyone is in place. And already he defines the conflict as irreconcilable. And he didn't make it up. He talked to decide. And he says, in the land there are Jews and Arabs. No one, of course, is called a Palestinian at this point. And he says each one of them has a top priority. He says, for the Jews, the top priority is to establish a sovereign Jewish state. Great. They want to exercise the principle of self-determination in their homeland. And then he goes on to say, and for the Arabs, and these are not just general Arabs, those are the Arabs that will later hijack the name Palestine to be known as Palestinians. He says, for the Arabs, the top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. By definition, irreconcilable. He's basically saying this is a conflict between one group, the Jews, who want a state, a sovereign state, even if it's a rump tiny state, mm-hmm. and between another group, the Arabs, who don't want something for themselves, like another Arab state. As their top priority, they want the Jews to have zero.
Well, let me ask you.
One of the key ways that the conflict is misdescribed, mistold, is reversal of cause and effect. So people will tell you the conflict is because there are refugees, people were displaced. No, the Arabs went to a completely stupid, unnecessary war, right? They could have had an Arab state, another one, living next to a rump Jewish state, but no. True to their belief that the Jews should have nothing, they went to war. They failed. People became refugees. It's the outcome. It's not the cause. But then they turn it into the cause. And you're seeing it happen all the time. People talk about settlements, checkpoints. Recently, I was in a conference. A Palestinian spoke about the checkpoints as if it's something that came out of like nowhere. Why are there checkpoints? Because literally minutes after they could have had their own state in the West Bank and Gaza as a result of the negotiations of 2000, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, holy sites, no. True to their view that the Jews should have nothing, they went to another wave of butchery, another war. And as a result, these are the suicide bombings, these basically blowing people up to bits for going to coffee in a hotel. Then Israel ultimately was able to use checkpoints as one of the means to bring this wave of butchery to an end. But again, this is the outcome of their choice, not the cause. It is the Arab continuous declaration that this is unacceptable. They're going to go to war. The war will be one of annihilation. That the goal of the war is no Jewish state in any side, in any borders. Then you have quotes that say the final borders will be clearly determined in war because the Arabs are going to war. But Weitzman and Abba Eban speak to the head of the Arab League on the eve of partition. And they tell him, look, why don't you just say yes for partition? Let's skip the war and let's just have an Arab state living next to a Jewish state. And he says, no, you cannot expect us to do something which we consider shameful. And here it's actually important because your Egyptian friend, what he was hiding is that what was shameful to the Arabs was the very existence of a sovereign Jewish state. The idea that Jews could be sovereign, could be equal, after 1,400 years of always thinking of Jews as their inferiors. The shameful part was that Arabs would have to live next to Jews as equals rather than as inferiors. That's the
Is this religiously based? What do you
I describe it as sociologically, religiously, theologically, because by the 7th century, when the Arab and Islamic conquests take over the Levant and North Africa, the Jews have already been dispossessed and stateless for about 6 centuries. So when the Arabs and Muslims come on the scene, the only kind of Jews that they know are Jews who have already been dispossessed, stateless, miserable. And as far as they're concerned, that's the natural order of things. As I'm sure you know, in their world, Islam is the final prophecy, and there is an expectation that the Jews, I like to call it the people who got the first book right, but not the sequels. So they're not really pagans. They cannot be kind of converted at the sword, but they're still not the equals of Arabs and Muslims. They're a little backward. So they are given an inferior status that has many humiliations tied to it that is called dhimmi, which basically is a kind of extended purgatory and limbo until they see the light of Islam. Now, for the Jews to reclaim their ancient homeland, to reclaim a modern state, to be sovereign, to be equal, is to almost reverse the arrow of history. Because the Jews in the Arab and Muslim mind are supposed to be headed out of history. They're supposed to be headed in the direction of the dustbin of history.
I see.
And that is a result. That's the shame. And there's this, as you described, this beautiful mythology that says that Jews and Arabs or Jews and Muslims lived in harmony in the Arab world until Israel and Zionism came on the scene and really destroyed this beautiful harmony. And I love to describe it as the harmony, maybe one that you could have in Gone with the Wind, as long as the Jews knew their place as lower, then you had harmony. And you can actually see that the waves of violence in the Arab world, already going back centuries before, they begin whenever the Jews raise their head. Initially, it's under kind of colonial ideas of emancipations. Then you have massive pogroms against the Jews because the Jews are assigned an inferior place. If they dare challenge that, the response is almost instinctively violence. I sometimes describe it almost geometrically. Imagine that for 1,400 years, you are being told that the proper social order, the just order, is to look at a certain group of people from this angle. And they tell you this is the proper society, this is the good order. And suddenly these people, they say, no, hello, I'm your equal. I'm going to look at you straight in the eyes. Your almost instinctive violent response, because geographically that means you're like, go down, go back to where you are. I sometimes like to give examples of that status. Jews could not ride horses. In the Arab world, those were considered elements of dignity. They could not carry arms because they were supposedly at the protection of the Arab and Muslim rulers, sometimes more, sometimes less. Many humiliating ceremonies of paying extra taxes. If you look at the early Zionist images, one of the things you see are Jews riding horses and carrying arms. And that is a challenge to the very proper order of things. And the violence began already, especially against the Jews in the land of Israel, long before, but kind of in the modern context, in the 20s, in the 30s. The Arabs like to pretend themselves as having been betrayed by the Jews that they welcomed. The last thing they did was welcome the Jews. Essentially, the Arabs go to violent kind of butcheries that look very much like October 7th, immediately when they understand that this time the Jews do not intend to play the role of the subservient.
What about their people listening will be infuriated? What about their argument that, well, whatever you want to say about that, I'll grant you all that. But they started moving into our land and gobbling up our apartments and our homes and precluding us from living in our land. So, even if we love them, that's not okay with us. What's the response to that?
So I'll do two responses. The first, it was not their land. This is part of the Ottoman Empire. This essentially belongs to no one. There is a notion that in the wake...
What's the land they've been living on, right? Some of it.
Okay, so if you are making it more specific, then here, that is absolutely easy to I'm trying to... So maybe you can use it later, but here, you can look for it here. This is a map of partition, the UN proposal in November 1947. And this is the map of incidents of malaria in the land in the early 20th century. As you see, it's pretty much one-to-one. The land is entirely malarial. It's very sparsely populated. It has no major centers. In the Ottoman Empire, it's not Alexandria, it's not Damascus, it's not Cairo, it's not Baghdad. What the Jews do is that they purchase, so the entire land is malarial, but the dark blue is entirely uninhabitable land. This is the land that the Jews purchase, typically from absentee landlords. And here they go on a remarkable project funded by the Joint Distribution Committee, head by a Zionist doctor named Israel Kligler, and they eradicate malaria. And it is such
I
a...
have to have a picture of my grandfather somewhere up to his
Precisely.
knees in the mud.
And as you see, the lands that were allocated to the Jewish state in partition are basically lands reclaimed from malaria and desert. So no one's home was taken. No one was displaced. By the way, the eradication of malaria, because it was for the entirety of the land, led to a population explosion among the Arabs in the land because their children were no longer dying. And in many ways, and true to behavior that became typical, they used the population explosion to actually begin the libel that begins in the early 30s that the Jews are stealing their land. But there's no one stealing anything. It's just that they see a growing population. It's because their children are no longer dying, because malaria is being eradicated. And rather than deal with it, they go to what becomes a pattern for the last century. It's claimed that the Jews are stealing, that the Jews are up to no good. But that's actually the remarkable story. The entire 20th century can be simply described politically as the transition from empires to states. You begin the 20th century when much of the world is divided between empires. You end it when much of the world is divided between states. When lucky, they go through a process of self-determination. They have some national, linguistic, ethnic, religious coherence. When unlucky, the receding empire drew some lines in the sand, threw a few ethnicities, nations, religions together, told them you're a state. They typically have spent the years since there in civil war and dictatorships. We have a few of those countries as our neighbors. This is a bloody process. It involves 2 world wars, numerous regional wars, civil wars. Tens of millions of people become refugees in those wars. Ukrainians and Poles and Bulgarians and Hindus and Muslims and Greeks and Turks and Germans and Jews, and they all get the message. It's not up to them personally. They all get the message that says the following: it's tough, it's tragic, and you move on. And they move on. And they build a world of peace because it was understood that once the new states, the new borders were established, this is it. There's no going back. Because if you were to go back, it would be just eternal war. So this is the message. One group is able to get an exemption from the message. The Arab refugees from the war refuse to move on and ultimately hijack the agency that was supposed to settle them in order to funnel money to ensure that they are never settled.
This is UNRWA.
This is UNRWA because they understand that if they are settled, it means that the Jewish state gets to live. And again, true to their consistent worldview for a century, they say that it's more important that there should be no state for the Jews than that they have something for themselves. The Arab national thinker, Constantine Zurek, who coined the term the Nakba, the disaster, in real term, in 1948, he describes it as following. 7 Arab armies attempt to subdue Zionism. And it's an interesting phrasing. Subdue Zionism really shows you that the idea is to put the Jews back to a time when they didn't have these ideas that they are the equals of Arabs and Muslims. So 7 Arab armies attempted to subdue Zionism and turned on their heels impotent. The Nakba in real time was the shameful failure to defeat the lowly Jews. And the entire text he writes is about how we can do better next time. Mm-hmm. So first of all, the message indeed to everyone else in the world was move on. And the Arabs, and this is where it goes to your point, and they, again, like to pretend that it's just about some desire to be attached to a home. The issue was always in the service of what? The Jews sought self-determination for their people in their homeland. And there was no question that the Jews as a nation and a people, an are connected to one land and one land only. The Arabs, and once they began to call themselves Palestinians, have created this notion of perpetual refugeehood in return for the goal of no Jewish state. If their vision had been like the same of the Jews, they would have had their state multiple times over. The proposal by President Clinton, by Ehud Barak, by Ehud Olmert, was establish your state, just like the Jews did theirs, and then you can have what every sovereign state does, an immigration and naturalization law, which you can call whichever name you want.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay.
And then you can, that's it. And then the Palestinians who live in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan can become citizens of Palestine. And they rejected that again and again because it's not what they want. They keep saying in one way or another that their goal is no Jewish state. Again, to their credit, they have been always consistent about that. And what you're saying is that I actually looked into it. Is there an example of a people who claim to be a people who want liberation, independence, self-determination, statehood, and who repeatedly have the opportunity to achieve that and repeatedly walk away from that? There's actually no such example. The Arabs do not ask for the right to self-determination. If the Arabs of the land asked for the right to self-determination, we would have had an Arab state living next to a Jewish state in peace and prosperity. But for them, it was more important. And again, reversal of cause and effect. You're saying this person's saying, I just want to return. But the reason people were displaced is because the Arabs went to a completely unnecessary war to ensure that the Jews had nothing rather than ensure that they have something. So again, the cause, the core issue has always been the complete, total Arab refusal for the Jews to have a state anywhere. And it's not a personal issue about this or that person. No one's happy with their territory. The U.S. is not happy. There's not a state in the world that thinks...
They want Greenland.
Yeah. There's not a state in the world that thinks it has all the territory, it has a historical connection, legal claim to. There was this beautiful map of Europe where you see every country, how big it was at its height. Mm-hmm. Every country in Europe, including Luxembourg, was once 7 times the size what it is today. No one's happy. But the idea that there is something unique about the Arabs having to live in one state and be a minority in a Jewish state, this is the source of humiliation, that they had to be Arabs living in a state where Jews would be their equals and would have a sovereign state. The idea of return came after they failed to achieve the annihilation of the Jewish state, and they established it in the name of continuing the war against the Jewish state. It was never an innocent idea. When I started this process of really listening to Palestinians and what they say, I thought in the beginning, maybe I'm meeting with the wrong ones. I met with Palestinians who are called moderates, educated in the best British and American universities, from the negotiating groups. And they would say things like, the Jews are not a people, you have no historical connection to the land, you invented it to steal from us. And I began to say, wow, what they think about the conflict, which is, what are we doing here? And what I thought about the conflict, let's just share and divide, don't even meet. And I began a journey to say, maybe I met the wrong Palestinians. Over 20 years of seeking, challenging, everyone who would tell me, you're generalizing, you're exaggerating, there must be other voices, I would tell them, please, bring me a Palestinian who publicly and in their own voice, and you're right, in the Arab world, whatever is said privately is worthless. So they have to say things publicly, because only when things are said publicly do you know that there's a chance of change. So find me a Palestinian who in their own voice, publicly, because as a result of West-plaining, I don't want anyone to tell me, oh, I know them, says, my vision for peace is to live next to a Jewish state, not from the river to the sea. I understand this means that we are not refugees and there's no such thing as a right of return. Those are the 2 litmus tests that basically fail everyone, except for the ideology in the name of which Hamas carried out October 7th that I've come to call Palestinianism. Palestinianism has 4 core tenets: from the river to the sea, there will be no Jewish state, and we are therefore perpetual refugees until return. And you're not seeing yet a disavowal of that. And when you want to find people who really want peace, then they need to disavow all four elements. Anything less than that does not mean that there's no partner for peace yet.